Hello, hello. Okay, that's really loud, but I'll try and talk quietly. All right. So now that we're live in all the media, so again, so with that sort of tension in your heart, you breathe all the way out, and then at the bottom of your breath, what you notice is there's this pause, right? And in that pause, there's not very much going on, actually. And then eventually, and sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's a second or so, your diaphragm says, okay, time to breathe in. It depends on how oxygenated you are, right? And then at that point, you let go of the tension and you just allow the breath to fill the body, right? And when you're breathed in as much as it feels natural, then it's called locking your hara. You bring a little bit of tension to your hara and breathe out again. So it'd be good to do that maybe for 3 to 5 breaths, okay? Nice long out breath. Pause. And then just allow the in-breath. So do that 3 to 5 times at your own rate. And notice the effect that it has on your state of mind. One of the things that can happen when you breathe in this way is that on the out breath, some of the tension in your upper body that naturally accumulates from sitting in the same posture will just collapse out of your upper body into your hara. It's like the breath almost realigns your posture. And then as you breathe in, your newly realigned body is filled with energy. Right? We sit with our eyes open, mouth closed, teeth and lips both shut, tongue lightly against the front roof of the mouth. And the posture of the eyes is downcast and soft and also wide. So taking in the periphery, bringing in the light, taking in not so much the objects or features of the visual field, but just the patterns, the light and the patterns. So we're going to sit for a bit, and I may talk somewhere in the middle. So. So at the beginning, I was talking about this deliberate style of breathing, where there's this sort of attention to and focus on, and maybe even a little tension, a kind of locking of the hara on the out breath, and then release on the in breath, release and allowing on the in breath. It's good, and it can be good as a way of starting out sitting. It can also be a good method for if you discover that you're feeling distracted and discombobulated somewhere in the middle. It can be good to do 3 to 5 of those breaths while sitting. But generally speaking, it's good to kind of soften the engagement with the breath during most of a period of zazen. Right? And so it's like you're watching the breath fall out of the body, and then return. But it's as though you're watching it from your hara. So the attention is on what's happening at the bottom of your diaphragm on the out breath. And on the in breath, this subtle shift from allowing the lungs to collapse and press the breath out to expanding and inviting in more air and everything in between. And one of the ways people talk about zazen is that it's just an activity of following the breath. I would say there's more there than that, but as a start, following the breath is good. Just to stay, sort of softly and effortlessly aware of the breath and of the changes in your hara and lower abdomen that accompany that breath, breathing in and out. And 2 things can happen. One is that after a few breaths, a thought comes up that has enough compelling power and intrigue to pull your attention away. And then you're not following your breath, you're following your thoughts and maybe the emotions that come along with those thoughts. And, that's what it means to be a human being, right? For some reason, we're the ones that have decided that our livelihood is going to depend on this kind of ruminative thinking. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's totally useless, but we do it. Right? And then sometime later, and usually it's not that much later, there's an invitation to be present again in the body, because I think some trick of evolution discovered that if humans really got wrapped up in thought all the live long day, they weren't good for much. So it's good to balance out being present and attentive to the body and being wrapped up in thought. So when that happens, when for some reason you're invited to be present. Sometimes it's because of a sensation in the body. Sometimes it's because of a sensation that arises outside the body, like something you hear, something you see, whatever. But for whatever reason, to take that as an opportunity to come back and see where you are with your breath. Are you breathing out or breathing in? Are you more likely to return to awareness on the out breath, at the bottom of the breath, on the in breath? No answer is necessarily the right one, just to notice it, that's all. And then the other thing that can happen is that the awareness of the breath becomes a sort of opportunity for intervention, like, I should be breathing deeper, or, why is my breath this way? Why does it feel cramped or tight? Why does it feel like I can't get enough air? Why does it feel like maybe I'm getting too much air, right? All these things, there's when we're aware of something, we're almost always judging it, trying to control it, trying to intervene with it. And that can happen to the breath as well. So there's a number of different ways that resolves itself. And in the end, it's totally not an issue. But sometimes in the middle of the process of getting to know the breath, it can be vexing and difficult. So it's good to be able to just let it go, to just stop paying attention to the breath. Pay attention to something else. It's okay. Pay attention to the air rushing through the air ducts in the AC system. Pay attention to the full body and how it's situated. And then when the opportunity arises, maybe have another look at the breath. In the end, the effort that's involved in working with the breath tails out to zero because there's no effort that's required, right? The breath happens naturally from the moment you're born to the moment you die. And sometimes it's interrupted in the middle there. I almost drowned once and I didn't breathe for a while, but for the most part, it's continuous. So just to stay close to that miraculous process. Just to be a full-on participant in it. Oh. Well, normally I'd ring the bell, but here, I'll ring it really quietly. Awesome. So, I guess before we do anything else, I wondered if anybody had any questions about the sitting, about what it's for, about anything about Zen in general, anything in particular about your sitting or what it's like to sit. Questions?
So I guess I call it like finding an anchor. Like I'm trying to still find, like, because you said the breath.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to have another anchor?
Of course it is. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, in the Vipassana world, often the focus is on it's essentially the sinuses and the breath passage. You know, and there sometimes people also attend to the breath passing through the throat. For sitting zazen, my experience with it is that you want to keep your throat as open and unobstructed as possible. So maybe don't so much focus on that, but a lot of people focus on here, right? And that's totally fine. I would say the function of focusing on the hara has something to do with the interaction between the muscles in that area of your body and the breath, because it's essentially it's a point of control for the breath, right? And something about what happens when you firm up this part of your body when you're sitting, it often has a sort of beneficial effect on your posture. So it's worth exploring. But no, it's really okay to have another focus. Yeah, totally.
Like, could I even, because if I'm really calm my mind, if I think spacious, like that tends to help me. So
yeah,
okay, still to focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so that's a whole other area, right? Like I was talking a little bit about this sort of way in which our attention cycles between being tangled up in thought and being essentially present in one way or another in the body, either because you noticed a sound or because your knees hurt, or sometimes the invitation to be present just happens naturally, as though it's on a timer or something like that, right? And the invitation there is to allow the attention to expand and take in as much as you can, and that there's naturally this sense of sort of spaciousness that accompanies that, right? Yeah, absolutely. And typically what happens is that broad sort of receptive attention rests there for a while, and then our attention gets pulled away by something else, right? But yeah, absolutely, that's right. Yeah, that's good. And you can use that not just when you're sitting. You can use it when you're walking around in the world, or driving the car or something like that, right? So yes, absolutely, that's right. Yeah, of course. Oh. Anything else? Oh. So I thought I'd talk about a bunch of Zen stories that that all center around this one guy named Choji. So he was kind of a Tang Dynasty Zen master, and oh. Oh. How old is your baby?
She's 1.
Nice. Really wonderful. Oh.
She was just asleep a second ago.
I know. It's I'm deeply familiar with that. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes they miraculously fall asleep. You know, my oldest daughter is in her mid-30s, and she had one of those swingy chairs, when the mechanical swingy chairs, when she was a baby. And my solution when she was like this and just wouldn't calm down was I'd put her in the chair and I'd fire it up, and then I'd play Jamie's Crying by Van Halen. And by the end of the song, she would be asleep. And I used to play in rock bands for a living. And once I mentioned this to one of my bandmates, and he said, that song has exactly the same effect on me. But it worked really well. It was very good, actually. So, oh, sweet. So anyway, the stories about this guy, right, are very peculiar. And what it says is that whenever anybody asked him anything, he would just hold up one finger like this, right? And it goes on to elaborate, like there's a story in another story about him that actually I guess the story about how he got that way is that he was wandering around. He was, oh, I know, right. He was a hermit, and the whole hermit thing wasn't working out very well for him. And so, well, I'll tell the whole story. So he was a hermit, and he lived in a hermitage. And there was this Buddhist nun, also a hermit, who lived nearby. And this is a weird story, but she came to his hut, and she walked in without warning, and she walked around him a couple of times, and she was wearing this big rain hat, and she said, "You know, if you can say anything interesting, I'll take off my rain hat." And he was like totally flummoxed. So she sat down, and they sat quietly together, and then she got up to leave, and he says, "Yeah, it's kind of dark outside. You want to just hang out?" And she goes, "If you can say something interesting, I'll stick around. Otherwise, I'm going to go." And he was still flummoxed. And so she got up and left, and he was like, "Man, what an idiot I am." Right. So he decided he was going to go study with somebody, and he was going to take off. He'd packed all his kit. He was going to leave the hermitage, and, like with a little bag full of stuff, presumably on a pole over his shoulder. He was going to wander around China in straw sandals and study with various teachers. And at the middle of the night, he had a dream, and it said, don't bother to leave. This great Zen teacher is going to be arriving tomorrow. And sure enough, this great teacher showed up, and they were having a conversation, and I forget exactly what they were saying, but at one point the teacher, when he was just about to say something, held up one finger, and it totally stopped him in his tracks, and he was like, wow, that was amazing. And so he didn't leave, and instead he just took on this style, right? So whenever anybody would come to him and ask a question, he would hold up one finger, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But anyway, he was sticking with it, right? And eventually he was running a monastery with this, and some visiting priests were there, and this novice was showing them around, right? And they said, "So what about your teacher's teaching style? What's it like?" And the novice says, "Oh, he just does this." And they were like, "Oh, really?" And Chuji heard about it and was incensed, and he called him in, and he got a knife out and he cut off his finger. and the kid, really novice kid, was running out screaming with his finger cut off, and the teacher calls to him, and he turns around and he holds up his finger, and the guy's enlightened, right? So and then finally, when he dies, he says, he's lying in bed and he says, I learned this one finger Zen technique from my original teacher, and it's never failed me once. And he held up his finger and he died like that. So it's an incredibly goofy set of stories, and it clearly is some of these stories have a flavor of that they might have actually happened, and then some of them are obviously mythology. Like there's one about a guy who he's teaching, and every time he goes to give a talk, this person appears at the back of the hall and hangs around and then disappears before everybody else does, and stuff like that. And finally, this guy is sticking around a little bit longer, and so the teacher goes and collars him and says, "Hey, who are you anyway?" And he says, "Oh, I was the teacher in this monastery thousands of years ago, and I answered a question wrong, and I've been living my entire life since as a fox, and I can just every now and again I can break out and take human form and come here and hear you talk, right?" And so so they have this exchange, and finally the teacher sorts him out, and when he's sorted out, he says, "Oh, okay, my fox body is dead now. See ya. Why don't you go give my fox body a monk's funeral?" So they go and they find the body, and they burn it like it was a monk or something like that. That clearly didn't happen, right? and this one is not so much that it couldn't have happened, but it's kind of it's got this kind of status of a fable or something like that, right? So what is that about anyway? The whole, Buddhism has had various forms in the course of its history, right? And in some of them, the idea was that you just work on your, like if you read in the Pali Canon, there's a great kind of essay on the, or story on the benefits of the contemplative life, right? And the Buddha outlines in great detail what the benefits are of the contemplative life. And in the end, after conforming to the precepts and meditating and sort of working with the sort of supernatural elements of the human experience and so on and so forth, finally your karma has been so settled that when you die, you just become a delighted ball of energy and float around the universe, and that's the end of it. And you no longer suffer or get born again or anything like that, right? So that's been one function of Buddhism, right? But that was not really what they wanted out of Buddhism in China, as far as I can tell. And it seems to me that instead the function of Buddhism is more like to deliver into the world people that are comfortable and skillful with the human condition and can help other people feel awake and alive, and themselves feel awake and alive, and that's what it's for, basically. It's and the methodology for doing that is the typically talked about as pointing directly to the activity of mind, right? So if that's true, then anything that, as you were saying earlier, brings up this kind of a moment of sort of spaciousness and connection is kind of the way, right? And this guy, and in the literature of Zen, there's countless examples of different poetic speech and walking around hitting people and I don't know, taking off your shoes, putting them on your head, and walking out of the room to surprise people, and so on. All of these things are these rhetorical and sort of interventionist techniques, right? But this is as good as anything, right? Oh, baby. It's not working. Oh, wait, maybe it is. and there's no reason to, if you find something that works, there's no reason to do anything else, right? And it's also sort of analogous with sitting zazen, right? It's like they've developed this sort of technical repertoire around sitting that's pretty much the same every time you do it. And in spite of that kind of sameness, right, it has a capacity to be liberatory, right? Partly because of the sameness, because you do the same thing over and over again. And that doing the same thing over and over again, just like holding up a finger, brings you up against the machinations of yourself and the complications of being human, and presents them over and over again until one day you realize that actually it's a burden and you can put it down. Can't put it down for long. You might, sometimes it's just for a second or two, but just that is enough to show the ways in which there's a great deal more to the human experience than we normally give it credit for, basically. That spaciousness, that sort of other mode of being in the world can be underpinned by this sort of unconditioned appreciation for just being alive, right? Which is great. And it can counterbalance our self-preoccupation, the ways in which we measure and judge and scheme and so on and so forth. So that's the, that's the one finger Zen set of stories. And again, it seems very unlikely that was the only way he ever answered a question. But they're not bad stories. So, any questions about any of that? You were probably out of the room for some of it because you were getting tea. Mm. Mm.
How did you get into this?
Hmm?
How did you get into the art of Zen?
Mm. So it's interesting that you ask that, right? Like the general agreement among Zen masters in the, if you look at the, the literature of stories around people practicing together and so on and so forth, and the work of Dogen that I was talking about earlier, the general agreement is that the heart of Zen practice is simply the embodied experience of the self and the world arising together, inextricably intertwined. And that's it. And the function of Zazen as a practice is mostly designed to keep you close to that experience, basically. And so when we have this, full body experience of the world and the self arising together, sometimes it's just, this kind of, as you say, kind of spacious, receptive, unloaded attention that, picks up objects of perception and puts them down, picks up thoughts and puts them down, and does all that in a way that's not loaded by judgment or any of the stressors that we usually bring to our mental activity. Sometimes it's like that, and then sometimes it's so surprising that it just turns you inside out, right? So I had this experience not all that long ago. Walking on Mount Tam. Are you familiar with Mount Tam? On the west side, there are these rolling but very steep hills, and they duck into these little canyons. And in many of the canyons, there's a forest, right? Because there's a creek there, and so something besides grass can grow there, right? And they're usually oak forests, but sometimes they have other plants in them as well. And it's one time, it was sort of during migratory bird season, and I walked into this one forest, and the entire forest was full of these little tiny migratory birds, and they were all talking to each other, and the sound was like only spread out all over this little tiny forest, right? And what happened was, this sometimes happens to me with bird song anyway, I must be tuned up to it or something like that. But what happened was that the spatial arrangement of these clicks was very, very precise. You could really feel it. And so it was as though the entire shape of the forest that was inhabited by these birds was inside my body. It was amazing. And it just literally felt like I'd been turned inside out, right? And it lasted for a little while, and then it sort of settled down, and, like, remarkable, right? The experience of being human is open to astonishing, surprising, and spectacular things, right? And there's generally speaking, there's the Zen school has a thing about words and phrases and concepts because they can be a distraction, but also people are really good at using words in a way that's surprising and delightful in exactly that way. So that like a lot of the teachers speak in this sort of surprisingly poetic way, right? They bring they'll say these things, and you when you read them, there's this moment like, "Yeah, what was that?" Right? There's this sort of miniature explosion. That's what poetry is good for, is it can deliver over the transom of your mind an idea that's totally without without a real world referent, and it causes this sort of surprise and discombobulation just momentarily, right? It's enough to kind of open something up, right? Like do you know who Charles Simic is? It's that 20th century poet. He's at the University of Vermont, and he grew up in Croatia, I think, or maybe Croatia, but he mostly writes in English. And he wrote a poem about alien abduction in this town somewhere where everybody had pretty much been abducted by aliens. And in the middle of it, there's these two old guys, and they're sitting talking to each other, and one of them turns to the other and says, they're so small they can sleep inside their own ears, right? So it's like something if you really pay attention when something like that comes through, there's this moment where all of a sudden your grip on reality is slippery, right? So they do a lot of that. What is it when the tree withers and the leaves fall, which is sort of a metaphor for this thing that happens when your body falls away when you wake up, right? And the teacher says, body exposed, autumn wind, right? Nice. It's a good image, and it causes a kind of experiential resonance right in your body. So words, not words, just walking into a forest, these things can cause surprising experiences that nobody would have expected, right? But it starts with staying close to your connection between the arising of the co-arising of the world and the self. Right? Anyway, so that's the heart of it. Does that help, or what do you think? Good. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I was going to read a poem. That's a good way to start with it. So it's called 15 Birds. And it was written on a beach in Mexico, just so you know. So 5 pelicans stage a flyby in formation. 4 hunting gulls wheel high above the eye of the bay. 3 blackbirds on consecutive fence posts salute the sun. 2 sparrows like wind-blown sparks. 1 vulture rides a thermal in the red light of evening, then slips over the hill out of sight. 0 empty track of the vulture, boundless mind of the sea. So that's kind of like the heart of Zen, and it's also like holding up the same thing over and over and over again. So anyway. What else? Anything else? So we have two choices. We could call it a night or we could sit a bit more. Which would you rather? Let's sit a bit more. Dogen, who I mentioned in his manifesto that he wrote when he got back to Japan from China, and nobody believed him that they should be practicing Zen, called it Jiju Zanmai, which essentially means self-receiving and employing samadhi. That's staying close to the co-arising of the self and the world and the self and the world. The only window we have to look into the absolute is the window that's afforded by our body and mind. And to step back and look in that window is the practice of Zazen. Unless you think it's simply about observation, that the only way to look through that window is to participate fully in being human, basically. Otherwise, we're just thinking about being human. you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming.